He stood at the edge of the red carpet, his hair tied back, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but nothing could hide the tremor in his hands. It was Cannes, 2023. The moment Johnny Depp returned to the world that once erased him. The cameras flashed, not with curiosity, but with forgiveness. The crowd roared, not as an audience, but as an army. And for the first time in years, he smiled a fragile, human smile that trembled between disbelief and gratitude. Just a few years earlier, his name had been buried under headlines, lawsuits, humiliation, exile. Hollywood had turned away, friends had disappeared. The man who once ruled its screens had become a ghost, his reputation shredded, his voice silenced by a verdict of public opinion. But the world had not finished with Johnny Depp. Not yet. Outside every courtroom, they waited, thousands of them. Fans who wore his face on their shirts, who held signs that read "Justice for Johnny." They sent letters, artwork, handwritten notes that traveled across oceans. Some called him Captain. Others simply wrote, "Don't give up. You saved me once, now let us save you." It wasn't a studio, a director, or a publicist that lifted him from the abyss. It was them, the people, those who refused to let him vanish, those who still believed that behind the scandal, there was a man worth saving. In one rare interview, Depp's voice broke when he said, "They reminded me I was still worth something." Simple words. Yet in them, the weight of resurrection. Because this story isn't about fame, or innocence, or revenge. It's about what happens when the world decides you're finished, and the only ones who reach out their hands are the ones who never met you. As the lights of Cannes shimmered against his face, Johnny Depp whispered a silent thank you to the faceless millions who had stood for him when no one else would. This is not the story of a comeback. It's the story of a resurrection born from the love of strangers. Before the scandal, before the trials, before the silence, there was the dream. For 3 decades, Johnny Depp embodied the strange, magnetic beauty of Hollywood's golden illusion. He was its most unpredictable creation, a man who refused to be ordinary, whose rebellion felt like poetry, and whose every role seemed to dissolve the line between truth and performance. He was the boy from Kentucky who ran away from home with a guitar, chasing noise and freedom. The man who stumbled into acting by accident and reinvented it without meaning to. When Edward Scissorhands hit the screen in 1990, something irreversible happened. The misunderstood outcast with blades for hands became the symbol of every soul who ever felt unwanted. It wasn't just a role, it was a revelation. And the world fell in love. From there, the legend expanded. Donnie Brasco, Sleepy Hollow, Finding Neverland, and then the phenomenon Pirates of the Caribbean. Captain Jack Sparrow was chaos made charming, madness made human. He redefined what a blockbuster hero could be: flawed, mischievous, drunk on life. For millions of people, Depp wasn't just an actor, he was a mirror for the beautifully broken parts of themselves. The press called him Hollywood's last romantic rebel. Directors called him the most instinctive actor of his generation. Tim Burton described him as a soul that could bleed through makeup. To the public, he was untouchable, a man too artistic to be corrupted by fame, too mysterious to be understood, too gentle to be cruel, and in love. He seemed to live the fairy tale. His years with Vanessa Paradis formed one of Hollywood's rare, quiet romances. Together they raised 2 children, lived between France and Los Angeles, avoided the noise. "He's not a movie star at home," Vanessa once said. He's just Johnny, a man who paints, plays guitar, and makes breakfast for the kids. He was the picture of everything people wanted to believe in, a rebel with tenderness, an artist with integrity, a father who found peace in the chaos. But beneath the perfection, small fractures were forming. Those who worked with him whispered about exhaustion, about the weight of always being watched. He hated interviews, avoided premieres, and spoke of fame as a disease that eats you from the inside. He spent nights painting in silence, smoking endlessly, talking about pirates and ghosts, about the loneliness of people who live in front of cameras. When you're loved by everyone, he once said, you forget what real love feels like. The illusion began to fade the way all illusions do, not with an explosion, but with erosion. Hollywood had crowned him its most bankable star. But inside, he was drifting further from the world that adored him. The parties grew quieter, the smile thinner, the sparkle dimmed behind dark glasses. Then came the cracks that no one could ignore. Rumors, accusations, courtrooms. The press turned his name into a battlefield. The man once worshipped as a legend became a headline, one word repeated endlessly, monster. Suddenly, the same media that had glorified him now demanded his destruction. Studios canceled contracts, brands erased his image. In a single year, he lost not only roles, but his identity. The illusion was gone. What had once been cinematic brilliance now looked like madness. The world that had built him now wanted to bury him. Even friends, people he had helped, kept their distance. He became the ghost of Hollywood, a reminder that fame can turn faster than light. For years, he disappeared into silence. He stopped answering calls. He stopped showing up. He played guitar alone in empty studios, painted faces that stared back at him with pity. I felt like the floor had opened beneath me, he said, and there was no one left to hold on to. But the thing about illusions is that they don't die quietly. They fade, and what's left underneath is the truth. When Johnny Depp reemerged in Europe, it wasn't as a movie star. It was as a man stripped bare. He joined musician Jeff Beck on tour, standing on stage not as an actor, but as a human being searching for connection. And the audiences came. Thousands. Cities sold out. They didn't come for spectacle, they came for him. They sang his songs, held banners, and waited for hours after the show just to say welcome back. For the first time in years, he was seen not as a scandal, not as a villain, but as a person who had fallen and dared to rise again. It was in those faces, the faces of strangers who refused to believe the worst, that he rediscovered something Hollywood could never manufacture: unconditional love. Because fame had once made him a god. But their faith, raw, loyal, imperfect, made him human again. And as the applause thundered night after night, Depp began to understand what he had forgotten amid the noise of success. Fame gives you attention, but love gives you purpose. The illusion of perfection was gone. What remained was the man and the people who refused to let him disappear. For most of his life, Johnny Depp had been defined by characters, pirates, poets, killers, dreamers. Each of them a fragment of himself. Each of them a disguise. But when the world turned against him, there was nowhere left to hide. The man behind the masks was suddenly forced to face his reflection, and what he saw was a stranger. He spoke later about those years with a kind of calm detachment, as though describing someone else's tragedy. When everything is taken from you, he said, you start to see what was never real to begin with. The loss wasn't only professional, it was existential. The silence after fame isn't peaceful. It's deafening. He woke up to empty rooms, unopened scripts, and messages that stopped coming. The phone that once rang endlessly now lay still. People who once called him brother avoided his gaze. Hollywood, the city that had fed on his brilliance, now pretended he didn't exist. At first, he fought back. He read every headline, every insult, every lie until the anger became exhaustion. Then came the numbness. The long nights alone, drinking coffee in the dark, painting faces on canvas that all looked vaguely like his own. He had lived for decades surrounded by applause. Now he was learning to live without it. And yet, somewhere in that emptiness, something unexpected began to happen. Letters started to arrive. At first, a few. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Handwritten, typed, drawn in marker on torn paper. They came from every corner of the world, from teenagers, single mothers, veterans, teachers, men who had been falsely accused, women who had survived humiliation. They all said the same thing: "You helped me survive." One woman wrote, "My son stopped talking after his father left." Then he saw Edward's scissor hands. He said, "He's sad, but he's still kind. Thank you for reminding him that being gentle is not a weakness." A man from Poland wrote, "When they called you a monster, I saw myself, because I too was judged for a story no one understood." Each letter was a mirror, fragments of pain and faith reflected back to him. He kept them in boxes, opened them when the silence grew too heavy. In a world that had canceled him, strangers were building him back, one word at a time. Depp later confessed, "They reminded me that I wasn't the image. I was still me." It's easy to dismiss that as sentimentality until you realize what fame does to a person. For years, the public decides who you are. Then, overnight, they decide who you are not. But in those letters, he was no longer a product of perception. He was human again, wounded, fragile, and still capable of love. He began to respond to a few, quietly. A thank you here, a note there, to a teenager who wrote about wanting to be an artist. He said, "Don't let them steal your imagination. That's the only part of you they can't own." Slowly, the numbness turned to something gentler: humility. He began to play guitar again, not for an audience, but for himself. He painted portraits of people who had written to him, unknown faces, ordinary heroes. His art became his therapy, and his fans. His family. One evening, while touring with Jeff Beck, he saw a banner in the crowd that read, "We waited for you." He paused mid-song, stepped back, and whispered, "You have no idea what that means." The crowd cheered, not knowing that behind those words was a man rediscovering breath. In interviews, he rarely spoke about revenge or vindication. Instead, he talked about gratitude, the quiet kind that doesn't need cameras. He said, "They believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I owe them more than I can ever repay." But gratitude alone cannot erase scars. The truth beneath his survival was darker, more delicate. For all the love he received, he still struggled to forgive the world that turned on him. Some nights, he said, he would dream of walking through a crowd that suddenly disappeared, leaving him alone in a hall of mirrors. "You learn to love the silence," he said, "but it never stops echoing." What makes his story different is not the fall countless stars have fallen. It's what he found in the ruins. He found a new definition of worth that didn't depend on applause. He realized that being loved by strangers could be more honest than being celebrated by a system that profits from your pain. And that revelation that love without condition still exists became his quiet revolution. He began to appear again, not at red carpets, but at small art galleries, at charity events, at hospitals. No grand announcements, no press. Just quiet gestures, drawings sold for animal shelters, visits to children's wards, guitars donated to struggling musicians. He said, "The noise almost killed me. Now I only want to do things that feel like music." Through this humility, his artistry changed. When he returned to film, it wasn't with the swagger of a star, but the stillness of a survivor. His eyes, once playful, now carried something deeper, a softness born from pain understood. In every frame, there was a man who had learned the weight of empathy. Because to survive what he did, you don't rebuild your fame, you rebuild your heart. For Johnny Depp, redemption didn't arrive in the form of awards or contracts. It came in moments of quiet, the letter from a fan, the laughter of his daughter, the applause of strangers who saw the human beneath the myth. It came from realizing that the greatest act of resistance in a world addicted to outrage is simply to stay kind. And so, when he said, "They reminded me I was still worth something," it wasn't self-pity. It was a confession that sometimes salvation doesn't come from power or justice or vindication. It comes from being seen, believed in, and forgiven by those who never owed you anything. Because behind every fallen hero is not just a scandal or a story, but a simple, aching truth. We all need someone to believe we are still worth something. And for Johnny Depp, that belief came not from Hollywood, but from the people who refused to let him disappear. The moment of revelation didn't come with thunder or applause. It came in the quietest of ways, a pause, a breath, a confession uttered almost like a secret. During a rare interview in 2023, sitting in a small Parisian hotel room surrounded by canvases and guitars, Johnny Depp looked up from his cigarette and said softly, "It wasn't the lawyers, or the verdict, or even winning that saved me. It was them, the people." For a second, the journalist thought he was being poetic, but Depp's eyes stayed fixed, unwavering. They were the ones who refused to let me disappear. That was the truth, raw, humbling, and perhaps the greatest twist in his story. The man once idolized by millions had been rescued not by power, but by faith, the faith of strangers. There was a time, not long ago, when he walked out of a courthouse to a storm of cameras. It should have been the loneliest walk of his life. But what he saw stunned him. Crowds lined the street, holding sunflowers and signs, some weeping openly. They didn't cheer victory, they cheered survival. One young woman shouted, "You're free now." He looked at her, nodded, and said quietly, "So are you." Later, he described that day as the strangest moment of connection if ever felt, as if the walls between us had disappeared. Hollywood had taught him that fame was a transaction. You give beauty, you receive devotion. But this was something else. This was communion. The kind of love that doesn't demand perfection, only truth. As the months passed, the connection deepened. Across continents, fans organized exhibitions of his artwork, fundraisers for his legal costs, tribute concerts, murals on city walls. In Serbia, someone carved his face into a block of marble. In Italy, A cafe named a drink after him called the Sparrow. In Japan, a woman in her 70s said she prayed for him every morning because if the world can forgive Johnny, maybe it can forgive all of us. Depp was overwhelmed. I never wanted to be anyone's hero, he said. But they taught me that being believed in is the greatest honor a man can have. And then, something even more profound happened. He forgave them. Not his fans, but the world that had judged him. He stopped defending himself. Stopped chasing redemption. Instead, he let time and kindness rewrite the narrative. He began to see that the real victory was not clearing his name, but reclaiming his humanity. He told a friend, "You can lose everything, money, art, reputation. But if they can't take your soul, then you haven't lost at all." It was an inversion of everything Hollywood worships. The industry that measures worth in millions had been forced to witness something priceless, the rebirth of a man through compassion. The biggest shock wasn't that Johnny Depp survived cancellation. It was that he emerged softer, not bitter, grateful, not vengeful. When he returned to Cannes, the crowd erupted again, but this time, he didn't raise his hands like a victor. He stood still, eyes wet, humbled. Cameras zoomed in, searching for the arrogance of a comeback. There was none, only grace. As he looked over the sea of faces, people chanting his name, not as an idol, but as a man they'd walked beside through darkness, he whispered to his publicist, "They were right. I never belonged to Hollywood. I belonged to them." And that was the revelation. For all the talk about justice and fame, it was never about winning. It was about belonging. About discovering that the love of ordinary people could be stronger than the machinery of a billion-dollar industry. He once said, "I've been called everything a genius, a liar, a sinner, a saint. But none of it matters anymore. What matters is that they saw me when I was invisible." That is what no courtroom could declare, no magazine could print, and no award could replicate the miracle of being seen and loved, not for what you represent, but for who you are when the lights go out. So when he finally put down his cigarette that day and smiled, it wasn't the smile of a man who had conquered. It was the smile of a man who had been found. And in that fragile, luminous moment, the myth of Johnny Depp dissolved, leaving behind something far rarer. A human being, forgiven by the very world that once tried to erase him. In the end, it wasn't the verdict, the applause, or the headlines that defined Johnny Depp's resurrection. It was something quieter, a heartbeat that belonged not to one man, but to millions who chose compassion over noise. Fame had built him. Fame had broken him. And yet it was love anonymous, imperfect, unconditional that put him back together. When he walked through airports or signed autographs again, it wasn't about reclaiming celebrity. It was about acknowledging a silent pact between artist and audience. I give you my stories, you give me your belief. In one of his last public letters, Depp wrote, "They didn't save my career. They saved my faith in people." That line carries the essence of his rebirth. It turns a scandal into a lesson, and a man's fall into a mirror for all of us. Because we live in an age that loves to destroy, to cancel, to label, to burn and forget. But somewhere beneath the noise, a crowd chose empathy. They decided to see the human behind the accusation, the heart behind the mistake. And in doing so, they rewrote what redemption can mean in our time. Maybe that's the hidden message of his journey, that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about refusing to let it define the future. The people who stood by him didn't just defend a man, they defended the idea that no one should be reduced to their worst headline. And perhaps that is the moral that lingers when the lights fade and the screen goes black, that hope. once given, never truly disappears. As he left the Cannes stage, someone shouted, "We love you, Johnny." He turned, smiled softly, and said, "You were the ones who never left." The applause rose again, wave after wave, not for the star, but for the survivor. And as the camera pulled back, the crowd became a blur of faces, united by one simple truth. Sometimes, the greatest performance of all isn't in pretending to be someone else, but in learning to be yourself again. Because in a world that cancels, they refused. And that refusal became love.